So this is Romans chapter 2, the scripture for the 3rd of September. Throughout much of Romans, particularly the first half, Paul uses a style known as a diatribe style. Now, a little background on this. This is different than we would think of diatribes being today. Today, I think the idea of a diatribe is that you're just haranguing somebody and wringing them out. In Greek rhetoric, diatribe more referred to something more of a staged dialogue where the orator or the writer has a hypothetical conversation with one party taking the side of the audience that the orator or writer is speaking to, and then the orator or writer will take another side also, poking holes in some of the logic that the audience holds. So this is sort of like a staged debate, in other words. And it doesn't work if you're going to be straw-manning the other side, using a simplistic form of their argument that's easy to poke holes in that doesn't capture the nuances. But when done right, it can be a very powerful way of exposing some of the flaws in one's own opinions or in the opinions of an audience that you're speaking to. So tracking Paul's argument through Romans becomes difficult because of this diatribe style. There are times when we may be uncertain if Paul is taking a position that he doesn't actually believe in order to discredit it later. Fortunately, our translations are pretty good about noting when Paul is probably taking a position he doesn't believe by putting quotes around it, where there's an imaginary other person, second party, talking to Paul. So be looking for that in your reading of Romans. We see that a little bit in this chapter. The falsehood that Paul attacks in this chapter is that some can avoid accountability before God because maybe they know God's law or because maybe they have Jewish heritage. It turns out knowledge and ancestry do not shield people from accountability before God. In fact, those who have the law will be judged by the law, the entirety of the law, in fact. There are echoes here of what we hear from James in chapter 2. The one who keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. This is James 2:10. So Paul and James maybe are not quite at odds as we've talked about before, but there's some overlap there. Now, Gentiles aren't overlooked either. This is not just Paul condemning Jewish folks. There's a certain moral code written on the human heart. And even those who don't have the Mosaic law have access to this sort of instinctual ethic. We know that it's not right to do wrong to other people. We have an innate kind of understanding of what it looks like to be kind and what it looks like to be a jerk. As Gentiles, even if we don't have access to the Mosaic law, we can break that instinctive law. But this begs the question, and the question is going to be at the core of some of what Paul looks at in this first chunk of Romans, particularly the next chapter. What benefit is there to being Jewish? What does it mean to be Jewish? If Gentiles can have the same access to God with or without circumcision, with or without the law, well, what benefit comes from my Jewish identity? Well, we will deal with that question in chapter 3, but for the time being, it looks like what Paul's trying to do here is to refocus believers on the correct things, on what matters. Believers are not called to be the final judges or the final arbiters of other folks' salvation or other folks' morality. We're not called to do that any more than Jews are called to do that. That job belongs to God alone. Instead, we, as believers, are called to follow Christ as best as we can and to help others do the same. That means sometimes we call it hypocrisy when we see it, especially in leaders in the faith. But other times it means that we look to live peaceably with all as much as it's in our ability to do so. And if we do this, we'll have God's covenant marked on our hearts, the covenant of circumcision. Now I wonder, how is God's name honored or blasphemed because of you? That's all for Romans chapter 2. Tomorrow, the 4th of September, we'll be looking at Romans chapter 3. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.